So Nick, if you can bring up the slides, we'll do a brief introduction. And while Nick is doing that, I always want to thank our patron members and our organizational members who make this type of programming available. And I find this very exciting, and I've been looking forward to this next presentation from the Government Accountability Office. And it's quite the honor to have four directors: Andrew Van Ah, who is the Director of Infrastructure; Elizabeth Repko, Director of Surface Transportation Issues; Heather Kraus, Director of Aviation Issues; and Jill Naumann, Director for Federal Asset Management Issues. I think these all tie together so importantly in infrastructure. We'll find out how the different sectors work together and how they separate out. And I'll hand things over to Andrew Van Ah, and we can stop sharing those slides. And Andrew, you have the ability to share slides, or if you would like us to share them, we can do that.
Thanks, Mike. Let me see if I can get this going here.
Yes.
That's showing up.
If we see it. And
okay.
Looks like, do you want to run it from the beginning? Yeah, okay. Perfect.
All right, so 1 second here. Okay, I'm gonna go back now. Maybe I can't control these very well. There we go. Thanks, Mike, for inviting us to join you all today. I appreciate the opportunity to engage with you all on the work we do around infrastructure. And of course, it's obviously a very critical time in the world of infrastructure, with the IIJA creating sort of a once-in-a-generation type opportunity for investment, where we can really make some presents the opportunity to really make some important improvements in terms of access to infrastructure, to improve the condition of our infrastructure, and to really think differently about equity within how we think about this investment going forward. And so today I thought Mike gave us a fairly broad charge for what we could talk about, and so I thought we would sort of give you an overview of the physical infrastructure team and what we do. We're focused on infrastructure, but there are other teams within GAO also that look at infrastructure in different ways. For example, our Defense Capabilities and Management team would look at infrastructure for the Department of Defense, for example. But we look at a number of different areas of infrastructure, and I'll get to that in a second. And then we thought we would give a little bit of a nod to our asset management framework, talk a little bit about how we apply it. And then we would kind of go around robin here with my colleagues. We can talk about each of our portfolios of infrastructure and some of the key issues that we see in each of those areas. Things like, key recommendations that we've made recently, things related to GAO's high risk list, duplication, overlap, and fragmentation issues, and of course, implications of the IIJA for us going forward in terms of mandates that we have to look at, as well as oversight that we are thinking of and planning on conducting related to that spending. And so Mike alluded a little bit to what GAO is, and of course, I'm sure you're all sort of broadly aware of GAO. We're the congressional, called the congressional watchdog. And we examine how federal taxpayer dollars are spent, provide Congress and federal agencies with objective, nonpartisan, fact-based information, and hopefully help the government save money and work more efficiently. And of course, when it comes to infrastructure and asset management, for our team, this kind of comes in different ways. So for federal agencies, we're looking at how they are managing their assets, for example, for federal buildings or federal personal property or federal fleets. Or VA hospitals, for example. In other instances, we're looking at how the agencies are ensuring that taxpayer dollars that go to infrastructure, that those infrastructure owners have good asset management practices. So we might look at how the Federal Highway Administration or Federal Transit Administration works with state DOTs or transit agencies to develop better asset management processes. So here's kind of an overview of the physical infrastructure team and our issue areas. We cover a wide range of infrastructure issues, and this isn't really a complete listing, but we are separated into sort of 4 broad portfolios. Our surface transportation portfolio includes highways, transit systems, maritime infrastructure, ports, rail systems, oil and gas pipelines. We look at this from a variety of different perspectives. We look at it from the perspective of safety and resilience, and the performance of our, how well these programs are running, how well the money is being managed, and of course, how things like better asset management practices sort of filter their way through the entire system. Our aviation portfolio includes looking at airports, air traffic control systems. NextGen has always been something that we've had a hand in taking a look at. Space transportation has been a new area we've been involved with recently, and uncrewed aerial systems as well. Our federal asset portfolio is also quite broad, includes federal buildings, the Postal Service, federal fleet, and federal personal property. Also includes security of federal buildings. So we look at a whole host of issues there. And then our telecommunications portfolio looks at fixed broadband and wireless networks. Spectrum management issues are increasingly important and cut across some of these other portfolios as we're on the page here. And then we also look closely at emergency alerting and communication systems. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Jill to talk a little bit about our asset management framework and give a little bit of an overview there. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that we've applied it. Jill?
All right. Thanks so much, Andrew. So our asset management framework, like Andrew said, this is maybe not news to you, but we thought it'd be useful context to the rest of our discussion. We undertook the work to develop this framework to really see what asset management practices have been taken across the federal portfolio and what standards and leading practices may be the most applicable to the federal government. And when we talk about an asset management framework, what we're really referring to are processes, roles, responsibilities, policies that are being used to make asset management decisions. In addition to laying out this framework, this report also really acknowledges that organizations can face some challenges in implementing this kind of approach, particularly organizational change, culture change, capacity challenges, and it gives some strategies for how to think about incorporating this kind of change in your organization. As shown in this figure, this kind of approach really includes buy-in at all different levels of an organization. There's planning and goal setting at the top, really understanding how each of an organization's assets would contribute to the goals, and then managing them and investing in those assets in order to maximize those goals. And then finally, kind of a feedback loop of a culture of leadership support, effective review and feedback, and decision making. And a final thing about on this slide is, that we did this report, we focused on real property issues, but this kind of framework can really apply to any kind of asset. ISO defines an asset as any item, thing, or entity that has potential value or actual value to an organization. So overall, this kind of framework and an asset management approach can apply to managing assets broadly and helping federal agencies optimize limited funding and target investment decisions. Andrew, can you move to the next slide?
I'm trying to, Jill.
Yeah. Whoops.
Oh, went too far.
All right. So in this slide, this shows the 6 key characteristics of our asset management framework. And we developed this framework and these characteristics through a number of in-depth interviews with experts and organizations. We reviewed the ISO 55000 standards, other leading practices and literature, and pulled pulled information from all that together to create these 6 characteristics. So I'll go through them briefly. The first one is formal policies and plans. And what we mean by this is that these kinds of plans can really help agencies take a more strategic approach in asset management decision making. And the things that you would expect to see in formal policies and plans are roles and responsibilities, resources required to implement the plans, potential obstacles, and strategies to address them. The next is maximizing the portfolio's value. And by this, we mean prioritizing investments to help target resources towards assets that will provide the greatest value to the agency in meeting its mission and objectives. And this can mean, for example, a scoring process for prioritizing projects based on things like the risk that an asset poses to the agency's operations, the condition of the asset, the cost or the impact of the project. Next is maintaining leadership support. And we heard this loud and clear from the experts that we interviewed in developing this framework, that this is vital to this kind of framework and approach being successful. Also, it's challenging to balance, incorporating this kind of approach in an organization that may take time to really develop and incorporate. And it's hard to balance that against short-term infrastructure investment needs that might come up. Next is using quality data, and this includes collecting accurate data elements that could be things like the age and location of assets, how well the asset's performing, replacement value, and how important or critical the asset is to the agency's mission. And those data elements are really important and needed to be able to make those decisions that I was talking about in the maximizing value characteristic. Next is promoting a collaborative organizational culture. And this really includes communicating information across boundaries in an agency that might traditionally not allow those kind of communication to happen. So really helping break those boundaries down and communicate across them to be able to make effective decisions about assets broadly. And the last one is evaluating and improving asset management practices. So as I was saying at the beginning, this kind of continuous feedback loop of evaluating the framework, implementing needed changes, making sure that it really still reflects the organization's goals that that's trying to achieve, and making sure that it is helping the agency optimize the value of the assets. So those are the 6 characteristics. Andrew, if you go forward to the next slide, I can talk about one of the reports that I was involved in that applied this framework, and then hand it off to my colleagues. The one I'll talk about is the one on the far right on real property asset management and disaster resilience. And we used several of the characteristics in the framework and really looked at how a few selected agencies were incorporating natural disaster information in their investment decisions. And we did this work kind of in the context of like the increasing number and severity of natural disasters, climate change altering the characteristics of these events, and the difficulty in making strategic investments to reduce risks in the future, because you may be needing to deal with immediate repair needs from damage from an event. And we wanted to demonstrate that an asset management approach can be a really useful way to guide investment decisions and show the opportunities of that to enhance resilience. So first we looked at the characteristic that I mentioned of establishing policies and plans. Did agencies have these kinds of policies and plans in place, and did they mention natural disaster resilience? And we looked at 4 different agencies: the National Park Service, GSA, Army Corps, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we found that 3 of those agencies did have some documentation to help guide their portfolio-wide decision-making and related to natural disaster resilience efforts. And they cover things like direction to the decision makers, information resources, and procedures to identify and assess the natural disaster risks. We also looked at the characteristic of using quality information, and we're asking, were agencies collecting data on natural disaster vulnerabilities? And we found that a couple of the agencies were starting to do that. The National Park Service and Army Corps had begun collecting some natural disaster risk and climate data that could help them, evaluate and make decisions about their portfolios. And one example was the National Park Service had coordinated with a university to assess the vulnerability of all the assets around the National Mall, the buildings, shelters, the trails, parking lots. And that assessment really showed the extent of those assets, how they were exposed to coastal hazards and sea level rise. And then the Park Service combined that assessment information with other information that they had about the assets to determine which structures were both highly vulnerable and had high criticality to the park, and that could help guide their decisions on investments related to those assets. And the final characteristic that I'll talk about that we looked at in this report is maximizing portfolio value. We're looking at, did decision makers involve or decision-making involve considering natural disaster risks. And we found that the agencies we looked at had did have processes for prioritizing projects and investments, but they were based on things like the asset condition, the cost, the criticality to the mission. They hadn't really incorporated yet information on natural disaster resilience into these investment decisions for their portfolio. They had maybe made some of those decisions or considered some of that information on a project by project basis, but weren't really considering that kind of information portfolio wide. So we also looked at government-wide guidance related to asset management and planning to see if it was included in that kind of guidance. And we found that the guidance does direct agencies to identify climate change risks and conduct some risk management practices, but it doesn't really include direction to incorporate natural disaster resilience into these decision making. And that was the basis for a recommendation we made to OMB to enhance the guidance to make that link. And those were kind of the key things that we used in the framework in that report. Andrew, should I hand it back to you?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And I know our colleague Bizarrefko has a time constraint here, so I kind of want to move forward. I just mentioned briefly the other 2 reports that are on this slide where we used an asset management framework on the VA. I just really wanted to emphasize that we use that framework in a lot of different ways. It's kind of a very flexible tool for us. So for the VA real property job, for example, we honed in on a couple of the parts of the framework in order to sort of answer the question. Our congressional clients were concerned that there was many offices involved. Perhaps there needed to be a reorganization around this, and so we really looked at the parts of it related to leadership, support, as well as creating a collaborative environment. In that report, and applied those criteria to what we saw in terms of how the different offices communicated, how they identified their roles and responsibilities related to asset management more broadly. And on the transit asset management report, we combined the asset management framework with a whole host of other criteria. So it's not the sort of the be all end all of what we use in this regard. So we brought in program management criteria, we brought in performance management criteria, we brought in specific criteria to managing transit assets that exist in other forums, and used that collectively and holistically to try to evaluate how FTA was trying to evaluate the plans that transit agencies had in terms of their new asset management plans. But with that, we can come back to that later. We'll move on to just kind of talking about our portfolios broadly and some of the key issues. And I'll turn it over to Business, and she's got about just a few minutes before she has to sign off. Bizza, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Been having some microphone problems, so it's working well. So thanks, Andrew. My name is Bizza Repko, and I work on Surface Transportation, Director of Surface Transportation Issues and PI. And what we just wanted to do is kind of walk through the way that asset management can intersect with our various portfolios. And so in the surface transportation world, the idea of asset management, some of the things we were talking about, like strategic planning or performance management, certainly intersects with my area of work, whether you're thinking about something like the condition of assets, something like pavement or bridges on the national highway system, or you're thinking about private assets like the railroads. And when you talk to FHWA, or when they talk about asset management, they'll talk about two things, sort of like prioritizing number one, prioritize what we need to do now and plan for it. And number two, what we need to do in the future. So I'm just kind of organize myself around that as well. So some of the things that they need to plan and organize now. So several years ago, the Congress passed a requirement for the states to develop transportation asset management plans for the national highway system. And those plans need to include pavement, and they need to include bridges. They're encouraged to include more, and also encouraged to include more than just the national highway system. But they need to be plans that have things like a summary of the assets, explanation of the conditions of the assets, performance measures and gap analysis, and things like life cycle analysis. And our ongoing or recently completed work related to these areas really demonstrates, it dovetails nicely with what Jill was talking about. It really demonstrates the importance of the need for leadership, and also the importance for performance management and making data-driven decisions. We've made several recommendations in this area. I mean, essentially, the states can't really know where they're going if they don't know where they are. And so we have recommendations, related to them completing this performance management process. And it's something that feeds into our high-risk work that looks at the funding of the nation's surface transportation system. I think secondly, looking forward to where we're going, I think there's a couple things in the IIJA that are really interesting in terms of the perspective of a forward look for asset management. And one of them is building into the legislation a definition of resilience. It is a definition of how you build resilience for climate risks and also for the risks of natural disasters, very similar to what Jill talked about. Maybe there needs to be more of that in the real property area. It also has some funding streams to help states address resilience. And part of the reason I bring this up is because that dovetails with another high risk area that the GAO has, which is the funding, the federal fiscal, that's not easy to say, the federal fiscal exposure to climate change. So another area where looking forward, there might be something in the IIJA related to asset management. There's also several additional areas that Andrew was sort of flagging before for us to continue to do work in areas that would be part of asset management within the IIJA, such as the use of discretionary grants, how there's equity in planning, and also planning of the electric vehicle infrastructure. So lots of different ways that we're going to interface with this topic in the future with work that we're doing. So that's a little overview of surface transportation. With that, I will turn it to Heather to talk about aviation.
Great, thanks, Bizza. Assume you can hear me, I'm lighting up. Yeah, I oversee our civil aviation work. Appreciate the opportunity. I mean, in the area of aviation, as Andrew mentioned early on, we do work looking at NextGen and FAA's efforts to modernize the air traffic control system. Have some work ongoing on that topic right now to look and kind of apply project management practices to see how effectively it is being implemented and how it was impacted by COVID in particular, and sort of how the agency is adjusting its approach to to implementation given some of those impacts. So certainly some of the practices that are in the framework, there's some broad themes that are very similar across that as we do that kind of assessment. So you can look forward to seeing some of that work in the future. I would say in terms of assets in the aviation realm, I mean, we do a lot of work looking at airports and airport funding and financing. A lot of that work in the past has looked at, the federal grant programs, the airport improvement program, the PFC, the passenger facility charge, and sort of the ways that airports are financing projects, whether it's through federal money or other sources in terms of bonding and other, debt that they take on to finance projects. Also, our work has looked at, the costs of projects and sort of plans that airports have going forward, the types of investments that they're looking to make, and sort of the gaps between what they have planned and the money coming in. Most recently, we really focused in on the CARES and the COVID relief related bills that provided another $20 billion to airports. On top of that, obviously, as Biz had mentioned, the IIJA did have another $25 billion to FAA, 15 billion of that going to AIP discretionary or formula projects, 5 billion going to a discretionary grant program for airport terminal development projects, which would be a new program for FAA, as well as another 5 billion to FAA facilities and equipment, and basically upgrading air traffic control facilities. That's a huge influx of money for FAA. And when we looked at the CARES and COVID related relief bills and their implementation of that, we found that FAA, it's a lot of money for them to process. It's a lot of money for them to oversee and verify. And so there was some challenges around, being able to get that money out quickly, and with the expedited timelines that they were looking at for those projects. So, they tried to respond to that by bringing in more folks and more resources and contracting for resources. But we anticipate some of those challenges they may face as they manage through the IIJA and have to deal with just their annual sort of day-to-day processing of AIP applications, PFC applications, as well as setting up a new program for airport terminals. I will turn it over to Jill, I believe, to talk about federal assets again.
Sure. Just a couple of things I'll mention about some of the upcoming or ongoing work that we're doing in this area. Biza mentioned our high risk work, and managing federal real property is a high risk area that we have, and data reliability is a key part of that high risk area. We found some really serious data errors that undermine the reliability of the federal real property profile database, and had some recommendations to GSA to address those. So we'll definitely be following up on that work and looking for any improvements that have been happening in that in our next round of the high risk report in the next year. We're also undertaking some work right now on deferred maintenance and using the framework again on particularly the ideas of data reliability and prioritizing projects, and looking at how agencies are defining deferred maintenance and using that kind of information to make decisions about what to prioritize in terms of conducting that maintenance. And then I'll touch a little bit too on IIJA. Biza mentioned the charging, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We've got some work on the postal side of the portfolio, looking at the Postal Service's contract to acquire some new delivery vehicles and the extent to which those might be electric. We're also looking at how postal facilities might be used for public charging infrastructure. And we have another ongoing job looking at how other agencies, not the Postal Service, but other federal agencies are transitioning to electric vehicles and some of the challenges that they're experiencing. So those are some of the key areas we'll be working on in this portfolio and kind of how they relate to asset management. It's back to Andrew.
Yeah, and I'll just touch on telecommunications a little bit, Mike, and then we can open it up for discussion and questions. So within the telecommunications portfolio, of course, this is largely private infrastructure we're talking about when it comes to telecommunications networks, but we're also looking at how the federal government manages spectrum within federal agency uses of spectrum. And so a couple of the big themes that come out of this that are sort of connected to the asset management framework, where we don't necessarily apply it directly, but it's nonetheless sort of within the same realm, right? It's things like, are we going through a data-driven kind of process to understand where our needs are? So we had a number of recommendations around broadband mapping and had some recent reports about FCC's efforts to improve those maps. So that we know where we need to be putting our investment going forward. The other big area that's sort of related is, again, going to that creating a culture of coordination and within both the broadband side of things as well as the federal spectrum management side of things. So we've looked very closely at how FCC, NTIA within the Department of Commerce, and RUS within the Department of Agriculture have tried to work together to understand where each of their respective programs that can fund broadband infrastructure, where they're putting that money, what kind of assets are going out there, what kind of speeds they're looking at, what kind of technologies they're considering, and how well that coordinated effort is working to sort of achieve the goals of those respective programs. Which kind of gets to the other area we've had a number of recommendations in, which is in terms of performance. So whether FCC actually has good data and understanding of how well these investments are meeting its goals to bring broadband to universal broadband to all Americans. And so those are the areas that kind of link up to it. Going forward, of course, the IIJA provides $40+ billion more for broadband infrastructure. That's going to be going out through a different mechanism than federal funding has gone out in the past, right? So now it's going to be administered by the states, and NTIA, Department of Commerce, is going to have a role in understanding those state plans and approving those state plans and setting in some requirements in terms of how those plans, what kind of requirements those plans have to meet. And so there's questions of performance and fragmentation, and how we're using data to understand where to best aim our investment dollars, all sort of multiply and become much more difficult to address. And so going forward, we're going to be looking at different ways that we can understand how NTIA is moving forward with that, looking at specific programs and how they're going to exist within this new construct. And hopefully have a continuing oversight role as that money rolls out. So Mike, I think with that, we've kind of gone through our respective portfolios here. Would you like to take over and facilitate?
Yes, but first of all,
Okay.
Great. That is so many things. First of all, Jill, thank you for emphasizing the framework. That is something that I think is highly important to remind the agencies to be cognizant of as they're setting up their rules and regulations. So that's real important. And first of all, thank you for doing that report and establishing that. We can tie that report to a growth in federal agency asset management activities. People were kind of attending our events and talking about it, but it wasn't until that came out that people were confident in saying that they were doing it. So as Jack Dempsey was saying, and Jack, if you want to jump in to join, your role of establishing the guidelines and ability to have confidence in proceeding is just wonderful. Heather, we had met with the FAA years ago, and boy, were they desperate for money because they had huge need and no money. And I hope there are things that a structured approach to asset management can help them with in order to use those desperately needed funds before they expire. So I know you can't influence that part, that you're just kind of there to watch to see how things go, but we'll reach out to our colleagues there and see what information we can be guiding towards them. And then Andrew, earlier today, we had an amazing presentation by the Michigan Infrastructure Council. And if there's going to be any look at how states are using federal money for their infrastructure, keep an eye on Michigan. They are head and shoulders above everybody else. I'll make a connection. I'll share you the links. But Jack, are you as blown away as I am by this? And
no, it's fantastic. I think when that GAO study came out in 2019, I guess GAO 1957, and they established that framework, it was, I mean, it's just provided the clarity and simplicity that I think that the marketplace is really looking for. So it's been really exciting to see how that framework has been reused by GAO and other reports, and I think it just kind of confirms that the work that GAO did with that first site, that first report, really kind of shed light on a lot of things. And I think it also, in a very important way, made asset management much more approachable. If you read ISO 55000 standards, they're very complex, even cryptic. I mean, they're written at a kind of master level. I mean, they're stating a best in practice at the highest level of kind of nirvana in asset management. There's a syntax to them that makes it difficult to understand, because it's like the whole system has to operate at once. What GAO did in the report, I think, was just exceptional. Really kind of showed these are the simple things that are really important. Provide some construct to understand them, made asset management in general much more approachable. So it's really exciting to see the work that they're doing, using that and reusing that framework in follow-on studies. So I can't wait to see more of that happening here in the future.
And Jim Dieter, CEO of the ALN, has a question. He threw it in the chat, but Jim, you're there if you would like to just come on and ask that yourself. And also make any comment that you feel free want to.
Yeah, well, I'm wearing out remarkable and amazing, but it's where all of this has come since 2014 when the ISO standard came out. I know there's other antecedents, but it's just been remarkable. And the power this has to make huge differences in how all that money gets spent, and making those dollars go the furthest they can go, I think is a huge part of that maybe we haven't addressed. The specific question I had for Andrew was about the framework and the applicability of that. Sometimes people don't understand, at least less physical assets like broadband, non-physical or intangible assets, the applicability of that framework. Do you see it as applicable to those types of assets?
Yeah, so the way that we've kind of approached that, Jim, is again, since that's private infrastructure that the federal government is subsidizing or providing funding for them to build out to areas that they wouldn't ordinarily do from an economic standpoint, right? So we kind of think of it, a little bit a higher level up, but it's sort of the same kind of structured approach. So when we think about, does the federal government have plans and roles and responsibilities? So is there a strategic plan available for broadband adoption and access and rollout? So we have a couple of ongoing pieces of work that are going to address that, and hopefully have some recommendations around that coming out in the next couple of months. But so that's one way of looking at it. And then sort of the other part of, creating a culture of coordination. So the agencies all have to kind of work together in order to make sure they're making the most of that investment. And so there's some MOUs in place. There are other things, other ways that they try to coordinate. And so that's another way that we use that approach to kind of address some of the work that we're doing in the telecommunications area. And of course, data is so important. Having the right data drive the decision making, that's another part where we kind of, again, using that very basic, simple approach to it, but those are applicable, but kind of at a higher level up than you'd get when if you're looking at a specific agency and how they manage their specific assets, for example.
Yeah, that's great. It's so much of asset management is, well, we got a plan. It's obvious. There's no silver bullet, anything weird. It's not groundbreaking. It's just actually having that long-term view and doing it. Thanks again for.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I just also mentioned, I just started to think about this recently because spectrum, which is, just radio frequency spectrum, is also an asset that the federal government needs to manage. And NTIA has, the interagency process to manage that has shown a couple of cracks and fissures over the last couple of years here, and sometimes well publicized, with planes potentially falling out of the sky if we turn on 5G antennas and things like that. And so I've just started to think about that and more along the lines of how are we managing that asset within this framework too. So, but yeah, so I think it can be applied in so many different ways.
Just one last thought is, in the Michigan panel, we got into a discussion that's near and dear to my heart. We have a standard that we promoted through ASTM on. It's an asset taxonomy that, in a fairly short document, just talks about different asset types, from physical assets to non-physical assets. But what they were very, very much stressing was on the very other end, from the non-physical, was, the basic natural assets, and that they're moving into managing their natural assets. And I think, it's another interesting area for consideration as well, that the government, the federal government, and of course the states own so much land, that applying these principles to the land, possibly the air, the water. And I used to work for companies that manage satellites for the government. So space is one of those areas too we should be thinking about how we manage it. So lots to do. Thank you all.
Yeah, Jim mentioned something that I'd like to ask, and I don't know rules and regulations, so I don't want to ask anything that's untoward. Let me know if it's not appropriate. But from what I understand, you are tasked to review the IIJA expenditures. So that work will be coming after the fact. But are there measurements and discussions that you're having with any of the agencies that help them understand what you will be measuring? Or are they just on their own to look at the reports? They're there and publicly available, so they should be looking at them. What is that process, and how can, what is that process? Is there any way to help them or influence them with their measurements?
Yeah, so just to clarify, we don't have a charge necessarily to oversee all of those funds or to do anything in particular. We have some 25, 26, 27, I can't remember the last number of mandates in that bill to look at various aspects of how, we have 2 mandates to look at how equity will be, considered, for example. But so it is hard to kind of get at your question, Mike. I guess in some ways what we'll be doing, for example, like we have some work going on looking at NTIA's new programs related to broadband. And so we start by looking at, well, how are you setting up your performance measures? How are you setting up your, where you want to make those investments? How are you considering some of the same things along the lines of that, of the framework? And so we kind of try to get in there on early when we have the opportunity to sort of give them an idea of like, here's how to set up the program well to begin with, or what we will be looking for later. Give them that kind of a heads up. Jill or Heather, do you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, just to add, I mean, along the lines of what Andrew, what you're saying, I mean, I think, we have had some discussions with, say, prior work related to discretionary grants and sort of the need for more transparency on some of those decisions. And so the IAJA has a number of new discretionary grant programs that they are looking to set up. And so just encouraging the agency to look at some of the things we found and ways that they might want to think through setting up those programs to avoid us coming in later and sort of coming up with the same findings as we have in the past. So that is something we try to do as well.
Jill, is there any comment you'd like to make on that?
I was kind of spared the IIJA mandates in the federal asset management portfolio, so nothing else to add.
Okay. So Marty Rowland says that nature as infrastructure is very important. He's doing a study on how to give subsidies to private forest owners. Marty is involved in many things, and I want to scroll down and get to that question again. I'm sorry. Jim, can you see that? Suddenly I'm not able to access that question. Oh, there it is.
You got it? Okay, go ahead.
When they should be paying a resource rent because private ownership means they exclude others. So is there anything that you're dealing with in terms of natural resources? Jill, perhaps in the natural disasters, when you're working with that, is natural resources part of the asset management that is considered?
I'm not sure specifically. I mean, we did in that job, we did try to select agencies that had a broad range of different kinds of assets. So so like with the Army Corps, some of the assets we were looking at were like the flood mitigation structures that they have, the levees and things like that, and other things like roads to different locations or structures. So we did try to get a broad representation of the different kinds of assets, but nothing really jumps to my mind that we're focused on specifically natural assets.
Yeah, I mean, as mentioned before, I think the one thing that pops to my mind is radio frequency spectrum, which is a natural phenomenon, of course. And the work that we've been doing to look at how federal agencies and NTIA manages federal use of spectrum, and just to even understand the various uses and how they might conflict, and where there needs to be more interagency study and coordination. So, for example, we did some work recently looking at weather satellites in the 24 gigahertz range that, those are sensing satellites. They recognize natural radio frequency emissions from the planet to enable weather forecasts, things like water vapor and other things that emit sort of in the 24 gigahertz range. So, when FCC auctions off licenses to turn on 5G satellites in the 24, adjacent bands, there's the potential to interfere with those satellites' ability to sense those signals. And so, that gets again into all of the various things that are involved in looking at the framework, right? What's the leadership on this? What data do we have to inform our decision making? How are the agencies coordinating to understand the potential for interference here? And how do we kind of evaluate, going forward, whether there's something that needs to be addressed? So that's one area that I can think of.
Well, thank you very much. Jack Dempsey, I think you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a general comment, but really interested in GAO's perception of this. So, we go back to executive order, I think it's 13357, I think it was 2003, that really kind of got the ball rolling or basically reinvigorated, I think, a conversation around asset management. Prior to that, we had GIPRA and the CFO Act. And things take a long time in the federal government to really understand and apply. So there's been a progression thing that's been going on here, but would really be interested in GAO's insights on what are they seeing? I mean, the executive branch is responding to laws and regulations. They want to do the right thing. Everybody wants to do the right thing here. But how is Congress's understanding of asset management evolving? And I guess what are kind of a two-sided question. What's making sense to them, and where are the opportunities you think where asset management can kind of continue to fill this void in terms of understanding how the government works and how it adds value?
Heather, you haven't been on the spot too often. Let's put you on the spot.
Great. Probably the one that Jill's probably in a better position, but I can certainly try. I mean, I think the sense, kind of focusing in on FAA, right? I mean, there's in that area, you have the modernization effort as well as existing systems that continue to have to operate as more things come online, as well as thinking about backup. And so I think, there is interest in finding out how to most efficiently manage and use the limited resources that are needed to most effectively, roll out those new programs to get the benefits that they're thinking with modernizing the air traffic control system. So I think there is interest in finding ways to more effectively manage for federal agencies to more effectively manage their programs. I don't know if Jill or Andrew have more specific thoughts in their portfolios.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been more of an understanding of what agencies are up against in terms of some of their assets. Yeah, and Congress wanting to kind of get their hands around it, like something like, how do we want to try to fix this problem. How do we fix it? It's not just more money necessarily, right? It's practices and policies and other things that the agencies have to have in place. But I think about, some of the work that we get, and we had a lot of interest around inland waterways infrastructure, for example, and just sort of trying to understand what state it really is in. Like it's the state of disrepair is, kind of beyond what you can really, put your arms around, right? So it's a long-term prospect to really get assets into a state of good repair in some cases. So I think there's sort of a little bit of a reckoning for Congress to understand what that really looks like, and then sort of how to get, make improvements along the way. Jill, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I'd agree with what both Heather and Andrew said. I think from what we've heard from some of the clients that we work with on the my portfolio, they are really interested in understanding what is the state of what we're dealing with, and how can we how can they help and get the most out of what we have, and the most out of the resources that they can provide. They understand the agencies are constrained, and they are looking for ways that they can try to get as much out of what's available. I think also with this framework, some of the things that we've looked at some issues before in like a different way, and I think there is a recognition that there's kind of a new way to look at these things. So I mentioned that work that we're doing ongoing on deferred maintenance, and we've done work on deferred maintenance before in other ways, but we're they've asked us to take like a different look at it, approach it from a different perspective. So I think they are kind of grasping that there's a different way to look at these issues and a different way to to maybe find some efficiencies and find some ways to make some things work better, like Andrew said, rather than just throwing more money at them that we maybe don't have. And they've also been really receptive to some of the recommendations that we've made. I mentioned that recommendation we made to OMB about enhancing the guidance to kind of make that link between planning and incorporating resilience information into those investment decisions. And one of the clients that we've been speaking to is thinking about, well, maybe we should write that into some legislation. So they're being really receptive to these ideas, I think. That's
encouraging to hear. Jim?
Yeah, just to piggyback off that interesting question, we've noted that short-term, sorry, my dog is barking. I am sitting outside at 70 degrees. It's beautiful. The short-term view, especially of elected officials, any thoughts on that, or any ideas on how to approach that as a topic to help people have a longer-term view?
We need a study.
Well, I mean, there's definitely this question of sustainability of this. So we have this big investment going on now, right, or will be going on over the next several years. And so, we still have on our high risk list this idea of funding nation's transportation systems and the sustainability of that funding mechanism. The same is true in telecommunications as well, just in terms of, we're building out all this infrastructure, but then what happens, 5 years from now, do we have money to maintain it? Are people using it? Is it, is there, are we following through in a sustainable manner to make sure that infrastructure is, leading to benefits that we hope that it would. So it's hard to, I don't know if you can ever get around the idea that politicians are looking towards perhaps shorter term gains, but GAO kind of has a longer term view of things, and this is why things continue to be on our high risk list, why things continue to be key issue areas for us to continue to look at. That's sort of the best answer I can give there, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just adding to that, I mean, I think that's also where, when we're doing these assessments using criteria like the asset management framework, it is in an effort to make recommendations to get agencies to think longer term and plan longer term and follow through on those types of things. So that's another, our reports can offer that longer view as well.
We do know that the Federal Transit Administration is advanced in its asset management understanding. I don't know how they got the wording into MAP 21 to require an asset management plan in order to receive funding, but which legislator do I have to ask to have you do a study on whether that is effective? Because I think that would be a really powerful thing. I think more agencies would start requiring that. And I'm, personally hoping that they figure out a way to put that into the rules and regulations, because if we give people money, they should tell us what they're going to be using it for. It's pretty simple.
We actually did a study on that, Mike. It was one of the reports that I was on that slide earlier. Where we,
the transportation
looked at
one?
how that was being rolled out. Yeah,
okay.
that was FTA's efforts to to improve transit asset management across the board, and with that authority that you just mentioned. And so we have some recommendations that are still open there in terms of having them have a continuous improvement process related to that. There were some things like different investment scenario tools that they weren't requiring agencies to use because they didn't want to burden smaller agencies, but we felt like there's still some opportunities there in smaller agencies. That's why you would give them the tools, so that they were able to do something like that without a large expense of a consultant or something like that. And so we have a few recommendations related to that, and that we will continue to follow up with.
That is the perfect way to cap this excellent presentation. Thank you, all of you. And I'll reach out and thank Biza also. This has been a wonderful cap to our day. And thank you for your efforts. I didn't know about the Government Accountability Office until I joined the Asset Leadership Network, and now it's my favorite federal agency. So thank you for what you do. Jack Dempsey, thanks for giving perspective on this, and the National Academy of Sciences Board on Infrastructure and Constructed Environment. Jim, thanks for getting this whole ball rolling. And Nick, thanks for being our Director of Technology. And if you could, we'd like to thank our organizational members. Yeah, well, tomorrow, yep, sorry. Tomorrow's not going to be as crazy as today. We only have 2 panels. One is on transportation, and the learning from international infrastructure asset leadership success, I think, is going to be really exciting. We've got quite a lineup for that. And then our patron members, including Definitive Logic, where Jack is the director. Thank you so much for your support. It's the first time we get to directly thank a patron sponsor. Thank you. And our organizational members, the heartbeat of our organization. And it's growing, so that's nice. And in addition to our program tomorrow, on Thursday at 3 is going to be with Michael Demers, who is now with Grant Thornton, but was with the Missouri Department of Transportation. And he brings a great understanding of the link between state and federal government. So appreciate all of the participants, the attendees who were here. Thanks for joining us. And again, thanks to the GAO. You do spectacular work. Anything we can do to help herald what you're doing, let us know.